Welcome to Behind Eyes Gaming. My name is Adrian, I'm from Giant Monster Games. I am not actually replacing Ryan, but I am instead coming over here to bring you an awesome budget modern deck tech today. Well, Ryan is actually doing a standard deck tech over on my channel. Link is probably in the description somewhere down there. You can actually go click that if you want to check out the video he did for my channel and see what I've got going on over there. Okay, enough with the chitty chat, let's get into what we're actually doing today. I am bringing you a deck called Turbo Fog Mill. Now, this deck has gotten some recent card additions, so this is why I'm going around and making a deck about it now, because it has gotten even more insane. So let's jump straight in, starting out with what are our actual mill cards. Well, the first two cards we have is Jace's Eraser, which we're running 3 copies of, and 4 copies of Sphinx's Tutelage. Now, both these cards have been around for quite some time and have seen play in all kinds of mill decks. They are in this deck because they are, again, doing very mill kind of stuff. Jace's Eraser is whenever you draw a card, target player puts the top card of his or her library into their graveyard, where Sphinx's Tutelage is whenever you draw a card, target opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into the graveyard, and if they are both non-land cards, your opponent repeats this. So if your opponent is not hitting lands when they are milling cards, they are likely going to keep milling, which is fantastic. It also has a side ability which is sometimes relevant, which is you can pay 6 mana, draw a card, discard a card, which is okay, but it is obviously a little bit slow for Modern, so we don't use it that often. But the recent addition to the deck is Fraying Sanity. We're running 3 copies of this because it is a 3-drop and we don't want too many of them in play, but once we get it in play, it tends to kill our opponent in 2 to 3 turns. What it is doing is we enchant target player, and then at the beginning of each end step, so our end step and our opponent's end step, enchanted player puts the top X cards of his or her library into the graveyard, where X is the number of cards put into that player's graveyard from anywhere this turn. So if our opponent plays a spell, that's going to be 1 card added to the graveyard. If our opponent mills a bunch of cards because we did like Sphinx's Tutelage or Jace's Eraser, again, we're going to be putting cards into our opponent's graveyard, which is then going to amplify what Fraying Sanity is actually doing. So usually, once Fraying Sanity is in play, our opponent just has a super duper fast clock. This is what is actually making this deck go from pretty good to, oh my god, this deck is absolutely insane. It's fantastic. Now, as you probably noticed, we need to be drawing cards for our mill engine to be actually working, so let's talk about some draw cards. We have 4 copies of Howling Mine and 2 copies of Dictate a Crufix. Both of these guys are kind of doing the same thing. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, basically. These are both fantastic cards. Dictate a Crufix is also awesome because we can play it for flash on the end of our opponent's turn, so we get the first draw rather than our opponent getting the first draw, which is what Howling Mine is going to do. And that is all I have to say about these 2 cards. The next draw spell we have is Temple Bell. We are running 3 copies of this because it is literally tap, each player draws a card, us and our opponent, so this is going to be triggering whenever we want to make our opponent be milling more cards once we actually have some of our mill engine in play. And again, we don't need to be playing this on our turn. We can actually tap this on our opponent's end step and draw cards on our turn and give our opponent less options, which is really what we want to be doing with this card. And then the last solely draw spell we have is 4 copies of Thought Scour. This is allowing us to draw a card, and it is also putting target player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into their graveyard, which means we can get 2 extra mill off of Fraying Sanity. If it is our opponent's turn or our turn or whatever we want, it is adding just a little bit more to Fraying Sanity's awesomeness. Now, a Turbo Fog deck wouldn't be very good without a bunch of fog effects. We are running a total of 15 of them. That's right, literally 1/4 of our deck is fog cards. We have 3 copies of Angel Song, 4 copies of Eternal Haze, and 4 copies of Holy Day. These are literally just preventing any creatures from swinging and dealing damage to us. They're just preventing combat damage, or they're preventing damage from creatures. Again, preventing damage that would be dealt to you by creatures this turn is actually really good if you're going up against something like Walking Ballista or any other ping effect creatures. So Eternal Haze has some extra benefit. Angel Song also has the added benefit of having cycling, so we can actually just pay 2 mana and discard it and then draw a new card, which again triggers a whole bunch of our stuff and just gets us a little bit more what we actually need if we're actually in a pinch and need to draw an extra card, which often doesn't happen because we have a ton of draw effects already in the deck. And the last fog card we have, because we have a ton of them, is 4 copies of Dawn Charm. Dawn Charm is not only preventing all combat damage that we dealt, but it can also regenerate target creature, which is completely irrelevant for us because we have no creatures. And the most important one is counter target spell that targets you. So we can actually use this to prevent some damage from a variety of different cards. Sometimes we can prevent a little bit of damage from burn if we are playing first matchup, because we do have a bunch of stuff to deal with burn in the sideboard, but we are actually thinking that we're going to be going against creatures more often than not, because Modern tends to be a relatively creature-heavy format, so we want fog effects, not necessarily prevent damage effects, because that is the name of the game. And lastly, let's talk about some lands, because that is also an important part of this deck. We are running 3 copies of Ghost Quarter, which is giving us some mainboard hate against Tron, which is a 50-50 matchup for us. Additionally, it is also helping us deal with man lands, which isn't super relevant because we can always just turbo fog them, but it is giving us some options to get rid of some lands. Next, we have some lands that produce both white and blue mana. We have 2 copies of Glacial Fortress and 3 copies of Tranquil Cove. Obviously, I don't want to be running Tranquil Cove because this comes into play tapped, which is really bad in Modern, but because this is a budget deck, I want to be playing some lands that produce both color mana without going over our $60 cap, which is what we had targeted for this deck. You can obviously be putting in more Glacial Fortresses and a bunch of other fetch and shock lands to be making this deck much more consistent in the mana base, so that is something to consider, which will be in the upgrade section if you stick around to the end of this video. And the last part of our mana base is 7 islands and 7 plains for all your mana needs. That is the entire deck, but first let's talk about our sideboard, because if you're taking this out to FNM, you're gonna want a sideboard. First of all, we have 2 copies of Forsake the Worldly and a single copy of Gideon's Intervention. Forsake the Worldly is being used to destroy artifacts and enchantments, specifically stuff like Ley Lines of Sanctity, where we can't target our opponent, so we need a way of destroying that. Additionally, this card also has cycling, so we can actually cycle it and usually get the win if we are in a pinch with our opponent and we have our engine already set up. Gideon's Intervention, on the other hand, is being used to slow down certain combo decks, so we can play this and then hopefully our opponent is a little bit locked until they find a way of removing this enchantment. So it is in there. You'll find a bunch of different uses for it. Next, we have a single copy of Core Firewalker, 4 copies of Negate, and 3 copies of Witchbane Orb. Now, all 3 of these cards are being used to deal with Storm and other direct damage decks, or even potentially Ad Nauseam. You can be using these to prevent your opponent from actually dealing damage to you because you have Hexproof or you have a way of countering their spells, or in the case of Core Firewalker, we can be using it to offset the damage from burn spells. And the last 2 cards for the sideboard is a single copy of Oblivion Ring and 3 copies of Tormod's Crypt. Oblivion Ring is basically to help us deal with anything we can't really deal with, so usually Planeswalkers tends to be a pretty good target for this. And then Tormod's Crypt is not only helping us deal with Storm and other decks that may try and combo off with their graveyard, but more specifically, it's being used to deal with stuff like Emrakul, which is once that hits your opponent's graveyard, it's gonna shuffle Emrakul and your opponent's graveyard into their deck. So we're gonna use Tormod's Crypt to completely exile their graveyard before that actually happens. So we need 3 of them because if we are up against a deck that has Emrakul or other similar cards, we really need a way of dealing with it right away. And that is the entire deck and sideboard, but let's talk about some upgrades if you have some extra money to spend and want to upgrade this deck. First of all, we can upgrade the mana base quite easily. We can be running 4 copies of Ghost Quarter, 4 copies of Glacial Fortress, 3 islands, 3 plains, 4 Flooded Strands, and 4 Hallowed Fountains. This is going to give you a more consistent mana base where you're going to have access to white and blue mana, potentially on turn 1, which you may or may not need. Usually you need white mana by turn 2 because usually not everyone's swinging in on turn 1 unless you're playing against Burn or a super aggro deck, but this is really what you want to be doing if you are going to be upgrading the mana base. Obviously, this is where most of the money is going because most of these cards are not super cheap. Additionally, our next 2 upgrades actually work really well with Ghost Quarter, and that is Archive Trap and Path to Exile. So Path to Exile is going to give us some spot removal, which is really nice, but it actually works really well with Archive Trap, because Archive Trap is if your opponent searches their library this turn, you may pay 0 rather than Archive Trap's mana cost. So if your opponent is searching because you pathed one of their creatures, or you popped one of their lands with the Ghost Quarter and they're going to be searching a new land, you get to play this for 0. What this card actually does is target opponent puts the top 13 cards of his or her library into their graveyard. So this is going to help mill your opponent really fast. If you have Fraying Sanity in play as well, this is going to be dead for them, because this is going to be putting in 26 cards from their library into their graveyard if you play this and you have Fraying Sanity in play. So super good upgrade if you are interested in upgrading this deck. The next card that plays really well with this deck, and you can consider upgrading it as well, is Mismatic Orb. So Mismatic Orb is whenever a permanent becomes untapped, its permanent's controller puts the top card of his or her library into their graveyard. So this is going to be putting a whole bunch of stuff, especially if your opponent's tapping a lot of lands or you're tapping a bunch of lands, you're going to be putting a bunch of cards into your graveyard. Specifically, if you have, again, Fraying Sanity in play, your opponent's going to be doubling up the number of cards every single time they untap, because that's the way that card is designed to work. Mismatic Orb is a little bit of a two-edged sword, so be warned, you can also mill yourself quite fast with this card, so keep that in mind. And the last 2 cards we have for upgrade are definitely more sideboard cards. They are Ensnaring Bridge and Ley Line of Sanctity, which you may have already guessed. Ley Line of Sanctity is going to help us deal with most combo decks that are targeting us and almost all burn/storm decks. So this is really good. I would highly recommend running 4 Ley Line of Sanctity if you could in the sideboard, because they are super important against non-creature based matchups. If you're going to be running Ensnaring Bridge, you could probably run 2 or 3 of them in the main board and then actually get rid of a bunch of your fog effects because you don't really need them. And that is the entire deck. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Go over and check out Giant Monster Games if you want to see more videos just like this one, because all of my deck techs tend to be like this, and they're a little bit crazy budget modern decks. I have a whole range of them, so go check that out. Thank you again, Ryan, for letting me be on your channel, and until next time, don't forget to game like a giant monster.